Tonight, as you know, we have the distinct honor of hosting Don Faber, an accomplished Ann Arbor-based journalist and author. Don will be sharing his love of Michigan history as he discusses his new book, The Boy Governor, Stevens T. Mason and the Birth of Michigan Politics. The book was published by the University of Michigan Press last fall and is one of 20 books selected from about 200 nominees to be a 2013 notable book by the Library of Michigan. The story of Stevens T. Mason is amazing for his accomplishments and influence of a man who became Secretary of Michigan Territory at age 19, the very first governor of Michigan at 24, and then died of pneumonia rather prematurely at the mere age of 31. There are a lot of accomplishments in those few years, and Don, I could tell you more, but Don will tell it better, so we're gonna save that for a little bit later. Don is a native of Grand Rapids and graduated from Calvin College there. He then served on the staff of the Michigan Constitutional Convention in 1961 and 62. That led Don to become a speechwriter for Governor George Romney for about a year before embarking on a long journalism career with what we used to know as the Ann Arbor News. There he was chief editorial writer, then editorial page editor, and finally editor of the very popular column, or rather the author of the popular column, Faber's World. During this extraordinary career, Don has won a number of awards for columns and for opinion pieces. He has a prior book. In 2008, he authored The Toledo War, the first Michigan-Ohio rivalry, also published by the U of M Press. Now, you might think this pertains to the intense athletic rivalry between Michigan and Ohio State. But no, this is an engaging account of the 1853 war whose outcome established the borders of the state of Michigan. The Toledo War was also a notable book by the Michigan Library Association in 2009 and was also the first prize winner for history writing by the Michigan Historical Society. Please welcome our very own talented and wonderful writer and storyteller, Don Faber.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, for that very kind introduction. Speaking in the Ford Presidential Library is very meaningful to me because as a kid growing up in Kent County, Jerry Ford was my longtime congressman. One day, I may have been 13 or 14, my friend and I were riding our bicycles through the village where Jerry Ford happened to be campaigning in his mobile unit. Purely on whimsy, I suggested, why don't we go in and see Jerry Ford? My friend concurred, and we went in. I have no idea what I asked the congressman that day, but he made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. And I'll always remember that, and I got a real insight into Gerald R. Ford that day. And what a treasure he was to Michigan and to the nation. Well, Stevens T. Mason was a treasure too. He was with us in Michigan for the decade 1830 to 1840. Fully 1/3 of his life, because he was dead already at 31. His life played out as kind of a Shakespearean tragic hero. And continuing in that Shakespearean vein, he was called that young Hotspur by President Jackson, and the term was not meant as a compliment. So in Stevens T. Mason, we have a tragic story with a mostly happy ending. A young man who was broken in spirit, disgraced in life, but rose to a place of honor and high esteem in death. . We remember him as a visionary. We remember him for being way ahead of his time and calling for an appropriation to build the Sioux locks. For that, he earned the contempt of the great statesman Henry Clay of Kentucky, who said, well, we may as well build a project on the face of the moon. But we have Stevens T. Mason to thank all those years and generations later, when Detroit and Michigan were known as the arsenal of democracy, because Mason's locks had helped to ship those raw materials down from the upper lakes to the factories and steel mills down south, where we then helped to defeat Hitler's Third Reich. He was also a visionary in the sense that when Michigan was forced to accept the Upper Peninsula as a trade-off for the Toledo Strip in the war that Michigan had with Ohio, nobody in Detroit or downstate wanted anything to do with the Upper Peninsula. Nothing. But it was Mason who bucked public opinion at that time and said, we'll take it. Because Mason had had the sagacity to listen to people like Territorial Governor Lewis Cass and Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, who had been up there and had told Mason, this land is rich in mineral resources. So that when Michigan was confronted with the take it or leave it, Mason took it. And he was very glad that he did. Mason was also a man of principle. He knew he was in the right in this matter with Ohio over the Toledo Strip. And he was confirmed in his judgment by the Attorney General of the United States, the top legal officer in the land, who, when President Jackson asked, give me a ruling on who actually owns this strip of land, the Attorney General came down and said, well, Michigan has full legal right. And speaking on the Toledo War, no less a personage than John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, now serving in the House of Representatives, said, never in the course of my public life have I known a controversy where the right was so clearly on one side and the power so clearly on the other. And when an Adams speaks something like that, you'd better take up and listen. But he was right. And Mason was confirmed in his judgment all along in that matter. It's also not too much of a stretch to say that Mason was the father of the University of Michigan. And I'm well aware of the contributions of old Judge Woodward and Father Gabriel Richard and the Reverend John Monteith, but it was Mason who best articulated the goals of the then still to be born University of Michigan. In that, Mason called for a university that would be unexcelled in the land, an ornament and honor to the West. Those are his words. He took as his Bible that majestic language from the Northwest Ordinance that you see on the outside of Angel Hall at the University of Michigan. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And it all came together for Stevens T. Mason in that remarkable year of 1835, when Mason led the charge for Michigan to become a state, prosecuted a war with Ohio, helped to write Michigan's first constitution, and was elected governor, the first governor of our state, at the age of 24, as Elaine mentioned. A record that will never be broken. Oh, and did I mention that in that same year he was fired by President Jackson? Jackson fired him because Jackson, had lost all patience with the governor over his conduct of the Toledo War. But in firing him, Mason very soon won vindication, because slightly over a month after President Jackson fired him, he was elected governor. And then in 2 years, re-elected. So Mason had a lot on his plate in 1835. He came to us, Mason did, from Virginia, was born in Virginia, of the very pedigreed Masons of that state. Followed his father west to Kentucky, because his father, being the restless type, thought that there was a lot of money to be made out west. The West was opening up in those days. John T. Mason, Stevens T. Mason's father, thought that this was the place to go, and he took his family with him. Young Mason enrolled in college, had to drop out, however, because his father's fortunes went south, as they say. And although he had vision and great ideas, as a money manager, probably not so good. John T. Mason, Mason's father, then prevailed upon President Jackson to give him a job. They were family friends. The Masons and the Jacksons knew each other. Jackson had just been elected president. John T. Mason thought, well, maybe the president can find something for me. And as it turns out, the king of patronage, Mr. Jackson, managed to oblige. Now, the good jobs were all taken by that time, but Jackson found a position in far-off Michigan territory, a job that was open as secretary of the territory. This is the number 2 position after the territorial governor. John T. Mason said, "I'll take it." And so he and Stevens T., they left the rest of the family behind until they could find housing. He and Stevens T. came to Detroit in 1830. Now, it's hard to say which was a greater shock, the Masons to Detroit or Detroit to the Masons. The Masons were, shall we say, well-bred, knew their way around society in Lexington. And when they came to Detroit, they found a frontier town with a sewer running through it, and perhaps not quite what they expected of this city on the frontier. John T. Mason made the best of it. He stuck it out for about a year as secretary. The governor at that time, the territorial governor, was Lewis Cass. Cass would, in time, accept a position as Secretary of War in President Jackson's cabinet. So Cass left, and John T. Mason also left after about a year, because in Detroit, Mason, John T., was a guppy swimming among sharks. He knew nothing of Detroit's politicians, about how territorial affairs were governed. We have it on probably good authority that he and Cass, the time that they worked together, probably didn't get along, and Mason probably was in awe of Cass, as just about everybody was, because Cass was that kind of a guy. Very formidable, very knowledgeable politician. So Mason, John T., left after a year, and then President Jackson surprised everybody by appointing Stevens T. as secretary to replace his father. 19 years. There were howls of outrage from the Whigs in Detroit, and from Detroit politicians, and from the leaders of the territory, and from the wiser heads of the territory who thought, we don't want to be governed by this young, wet behind the ears upstart from Kentucky. He's not even from Michigan. What does he know? Mason, for his part, said, look, I know I'm young. I know I'm inexperienced. I know that maybe you don't particularly like me, but President Jackson reposed all this confidence in me, and I'm asking you to do the same. What's more, I'll be happy to ask my elders for their advice. Well, this disarmed Mason's critics, if not overnight, fairly soon, because the territory then soon took a liking to this young man. He was willing to learn. He had Jackson's confidence. He seemed to have learned his lessons well when he was tagging along with his father following Cass, because we know from the record that Mason went along with his father to the Capitol when his father was working for Cass, and they were doing odds and ends, and Cass would order Mason to do something or other, and John T. would maybe do it, maybe not, but his son was picking up all these ideas about the territory, and he was getting to know their politicians. So Mason, young Mason, learned very well. Now, President Jackson, after Cass had left as territorial governor, then appointed George Porter of Pennsylvania as the territorial governor. So you would have in tandem Governor Porter and Stevens T. Mason. Now, as it turns out, Porter was not one to let his business interests go awry, and so he very rarely set foot in Michigan. I guess you could do that in those days, because that gave young Mason the opportunity to be the acting governor. So on one of the occasions, rare occasions, when Porter did come back to Michigan, his timing was terrible, because he came during one of the cholera epidemics in Detroit. And Porter fell victim. So it's one of the great ironies of Michigan politics, that one of the early Michigan history, that one of the very few times that Porter came to Michigan, he died here and is buried here. Now, Mason is acting governor, and Jackson, President Jackson, takes his time about appointing a new territorial governor. When he did, the United States Senate rejected the nomination, which left the door open again for Stevens T. Mason to continue as acting governor. Now, Mason has as his lifetime goal a vision that has Michigan becoming a state. This was his top goal. He ordered a census to be taken, which would confirm for all time that Michigan had enough citizens to qualify for statehood. And then Mason called for a state constitutional convention to write this document, this Constitution, which would then be submitted to Congress for approval. Except that he did this without congressional authorization. And one didn't do that in those days, if ever. So now we have Mason charging full speed ahead for statehood, but already he's earned some enemies in Washington because you have to wait for congressional approval to do this, and he hadn't done it. But Mason pushes ahead anyway. And it all came to a head in early 1835 when the governor meets a formidable obstacle in the person of Robert Lucas of Ohio and the state of Ohio. Because at this time, Ohio is prepared to press its claims to the Toledo Strip. And for that, I need to go into a little background. Ohio, in its 1803 Constitution, submitted a document which altered its boundary line so that it would include the port of Toledo, which was then developing. The port of Toledo, which would be on Lake Erie. Michigan had all along claimed as its southern boundary a line that extended from Lake Michigan to Lake Erie, which included the port of Toledo. The two states ordered a survey, each one coming up with different conclusion, of course, as to who owned the land. And the chunk of land between the two survey lines was called the Toledo Strip, about 470 square miles of mostly farm and swamp. Nothing much happened except that during the 1820s or so, Michigan moved people into this territory, organized it into townships, collected taxes, and one would think had every full legal right to this territory. In the meantime, Ohio had been working with Indiana in building a series of canals, which in Ohio's case would link her with Lake Erie on the north, with the Ohio River on the south, and the Wabash on the west. And Ohio wanted its investors to be sure that the terminus of this canal would not only be in Ohio, but it would be at that port of Toledo. And Toledo was at the heart of this dispute now. The two states mobilized their militias in 1835. President Jackson tried very hard to mediate and even sent a couple of peace commissioners out this way to get the Governor Lucas and Governor Mason to agree on something they couldn't. Mason was not going to back down one bit. Governor Lucas was not going to back down one bit because as an established state, one didn't allow one's territory to be taken by a state or a territory that hadn't even become a state yet. So, over the course of the summer of 1835, the war played out in a series of skirmishes that produced very little. For both sides, there was no victories, no defeats, no fatalities, and only a few casualties as far as persons or livestock were concerned. But Mason persisted in keeping the Toledo War front and center in the minds of our citizens. And Ohio was determined that this was not going to happen. And so the end result was that after a whole series of inconclusive skirmishes, the war ended, kind of on a whimper, But there was one thing that was conclusive, and that was that Mason lost his job. President Jackson fired him, and as I mentioned, Michigan citizens then returned Mason to office, or elected him to office, in the first gubernatorial election that we had. The Toledo War kind of simmered until 1836. Michigan went through all this commotion over Toledo, but we were no nearer to statehood, and Mason knew that. So finally they had to accept the compromise, a deal brokered by Congress, whereby if Michigan signed off once and for all on the Toledo Strip, they could become a state. One of the very few instances in American history where conditions were attached to statehood. Normally, if you wanted to become a state, you submitted your Republican Constitution, you confirmed that we have enough residents required at the time, and then Congress okayed it, but not this time. Michigan's birth was extremely difficult. And if you think that the bid for statehood began already in 1832, it wasn't really finished until 1837 when Congress finally got around to approving Michigan statehood. Congress brokered the deal, said that Michigan sign off on Toledo. We'll give you the western 2/3 of the Upper Peninsula if you'll keep your mouth shut and just do as we say. And that's where, as I mentioned, Mason said, we'll take it. It took 2 tries, but Congress had also made Michigan, another condition of statehood, call a convention whereby the only item on the agenda was we give up on Toledo. The first try here in Ann Arbor at the courthouse, the first try ended with the Michigan delegates from all over Michigan saying no to the terms of Congress, no to Ohio, we don't want any part of this, Toledo is ours. But again, that got Michigan no nearer to statehood, so Mason took the lead and called for another convention, probably illegal, since there was no provision for this at any time to do something like this. Called for another convention. It was boycotted by the Whigs and other elements of Detroit, who thought it would be better if we just waited, we'll become a state eventually, but let's not get any more people angry at us. The second convention, again in Ann Arbor, produced what you may recognize as the Frostbitten Convention, because it was so cold at that time. And then Michigan delegates approved the deal, the terms of Congress, and with that, Michigan became a state in January of 1837. Much jubilation, much happiness, lots of parties in Detroit. And that was probably the high point of Governor Mason's career, because his timing as far as Michigan statehood was concerned wasn't the best. That surplus that Congress had at that time and had voted to give to the states, mind you, they had a surplus in those days. The United States Treasury had a surplus. Michigan's share of that surplus was about $400,000. Michigan became a state, and our own treasury was empty. We were broke. Without intending to, Governor Mason set the pattern for Michigan's economy that continues to this day. Up and down, prosperity and payless paydays, good times and bad, because the 1837 national financial panic hit at the time Michigan became a state. and Michigan was severely impacted. Governor Mason had listened to his legislature, and he had outlined a very broad program of internal improvements, roads and canals and railroads, which were going to open up Michigan and make Michigan a great thriving state so that we could join our brethren in the Union and become one of the great states. The land favored it. We had rivers, we had the Great Lakes, everything pointed to prosperity. And then the financial panic hit, and Michigan was hit hard because, first of all, we didn't have the money to fund these improvements because it was all based on future, on anticipated revenue. And then the legislature authorized Mason to try and bail Michigan out. See what you can do, Governor. Go to those banking houses in New York and Philadelphia and see if you can get a loan to get Michigan on the right track and pay for these improvements. $5 million. That was the amount authorized. Now, for all his other gifts, Mason was not a financier. And he was in over his head against those bankers in New York and Philadelphia. He did the best he could. He negotiated the $5 million loan on terms not particularly favorable to Michigan, but then the national economic climate wasn't particularly favorable either. And we know bankers, being bankers, don't like to take risks, and Michigan was a high-risk state. Mason concluded the deal, came back to Detroit by steamer up the Hudson River to Albany, across the Erie Canal, to Buffalo, and Lake Erie, and Detroit, with a trunk full of notes, banknotes, from that $5 million loan. Along the way, some of the notes came up missing, so that when they got to Detroit, they were missing some money. Mason had not let that trunk out of his sight, except for one occasion in New York. And I'm thinking, I can't prove it, but it may be one of the nights that he went out and courted his future wife. That was the only time Mason let it out of his sight, but when he got home to Detroit, the money was missing. Now what to do? His opponents leaped on this and accused Mason of defrauding the state. The money showed up later, all of it, but by that time the damage was done. Mason was accused of defrauding the state, of helping to bankrupt Michigan's economy, and it only got worse from there. Mason was up for re-election in 1837, and he ran for re-election, but won only narrowly. And by now, his opponents were in full cry, including some members of his own Democratic Party. And when his opponents found that Mason was vulnerable, they jumped on him with everything they had, led by William Woodbridge, a Whig who would actually succeed Mason as governor eventually. Woodbridge was a great leader, but he really had something in his head against Mason. He was ruthless, just crucified Mason. In depicting him as someone who had just completely bankrupted Michigan, had sold out on Toledo, and had just been the worst possible leader that Michigan could ever have had. Vilified, character assassination. When he tried to mount his own defense, Mason was denied access to the legal records. He was denied an opportunity to speak in the legislature. And he was so broken in spirit by this time that he had to resort to taking out ads in the newspaper to mount a defense in his cause. In the meantime, things were going still worse in Michigan. The farms failed. The banks failed. Wildcat banks sprang up all over the state of Michigan, issuing worthless paper money, which you couldn't redeem for anything. The financial panic at the national continued to get worse. And so Mason found himself extremely in a position where his opponents could do a lot of damage to him, and they did. He did the best he could, but in 1839 he declined to run for re-election. Everybody knew he was damaged goods by that time, and he didn't want to take a chance on a defeat, so he left office and tried to practice law in Detroit. He had studied law briefly when he was secretary and became knowledgeable in the law. But the law practice in Detroit didn't work out. He had married Julia Phelps in the meantime. She was a socialite from New York. Apparently she didn't like Detroit very much, and she certainly didn't like the way he was being treated. Her darling husband was being treated by the press and by his opponents. So she prevailed upon him to go to New York, where she was from, and practice law in the city of New York, which Mason tried to do. Again, not very successfully. He was cast in the role of kind of a public defender in New York. And they didn't have reciprocity in those days, so he had to study for law all over again in New York when he moved to New York. So that took some time. He was becoming a father, raising a family, and he had hopes that if he made the right connections in the big city, that he would succeed. And whether he ever nursed any hopes for a comeback in Michigan, I don't know. I can speculate, but we don't know. Mason practiced law, was called upon to give a speech now and then, but things weren't working out very well, and he fell into, I guess we'd call it, a depression. On New Year's Day, 1843, he was invited to a party at the home of the writer Washington Irving. Mason accepted the party invitation, came home not feeling well at all, and took to bed, and within a couple of days had been diagnosed with pneumonia, and very shortly after that died. 31. 3 children. And if you think that his wife didn't have plenty on her plate, their youngest son died within a year of Mason's death. So, when news of this got to Detroit a few days later, here's what the Detroit Free Press said. January 13, 1843. This gifted orator, this talented statesman, this high-souled patriot, a warm, generous, noble, and magnanimous friend. He was a statesman of enlarged views, an ornament to human nature. Now, as the years and the generations rolled by, Mason came to be accepted by Michiganians as a true hero, as a man who had set in place many of our institutions, and he was accepted as a person who had done his best, a man of integrity, a man of principle, honest, who had set Michigan off on the right course. So that by the time 1905 rolls around, arrangements were made to bring Governor Mason's remains back to Michigan from his grave in New York. So he was exhumed from Marble Cemetery in New York and brought back to Detroit on a funeral train and given the full statesman's treatment as far as remarks by politicians and reburial was concerned. He was reburied on the site of Michigan's first Capitol, Capitol Park in Detroit. And there he would remain for all eternity. Well, eternity only lasted about 50 years. Because in 1955, the city of Detroit had plans to build a bus station in Capitol Park, and therefore Governor Mason had to be removed. The governor was exhumed. They couldn't find his body first, his casket. They dug around for a while, but they found it. And after an appropriate period of time, they built the bus station and they reburied Governor Mason in Capitol Park for all eternity. This eternity lasted slightly over 50 years when it came time to exhume Governor Mason yet again, which only proves, I suppose, the old adage that it's hard to keep a good man down. Anyway, Detroit had plans for Capitol Park. They refigured the park. They dug up the governor yet again, and they stored his remains in a funeral home until such time came for his reburial. This was in 2011. They exhumed him in 2010. 2011 was the 200th anniversary of his birth. I had the great good fortune, as his biographer and as a historian, to spend some time with Governor Mason and his open casket. To me, this was very meaningful. I guess it would be like if a Lincoln scholar would be at Lincoln's when they reburied him. But anyway, I had some time with Governor Mason. The funeral home attendant left me, and I had some time, about 10 minutes or so, to spend with the governor and thinking back to what life may have been like in the 1830s. It's very important to me. I'd like to close these remarks with something that was said about Governor Mason when his remains were brought back to Michigan in 1905. This is from Clarence M. Burton, who at the time was president of the Michigan Pioneer and Historical Society. This is what he said at Mason's interment on June 4, 1905. If the citizens of Michigan take pride in our just and liberal laws, in the numberless schools that crown the hills of our country, in the splendid university that gives a name to Michigan throughout the civilized world, let them remember that the man above all others who worked to accomplish these ends was Michigan's boy governor. But let's let Governor Mason have the last word tonight, shall we? Here's what he said on education. Let there be a diffusion of knowledge among the people. Depend upon the power of a liberal and enlightened public. Guard the education of the rising generation. And so I give you Stevens T. Mason, a young hero for a young state, and a man who was faithful to his moment in history. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have at this time about the boy governor, how he got his name, which is kind of interesting in itself because it has a local connection. One of our Ann Arbor newspaper editors at that time hung that nickname on him. He didn't like it one bit. And the story goes that he encountered this editor on the streets of Detroit once and actually punched him out, which I suppose is every reporter's dream, punching out an editor. But anyway, that's the way the story goes, and he had to live with that name his entire life, along with Hotspur, something that Jackson conferred upon him, perhaps out of a sense of respect as well, because Jackson had mentored Mason, and he may from afar have kind of admired what this young man was doing in Michigan territory. But Jackson put party first, and Mason was threatening to wreck the Democratic Party in Michigan and ruin the presidential election prospects for 1836. So Jackson took it upon himself to fire Mason, as he had every right to do, because he served at his pleasure. Mason was, I'm making him out to be some kind of a saint, perhaps, but of course we know that he wasn't. He could be impetuous, and he could be conciliatory, and he was at different times during the Ohio War. As a lawyer, he probably should have known better than to insist on Michigan's southern boundary the way it was based on the Northwest Ordinance, when in point of fact, when the United States adopted the United States Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance, for all intents and purposes, was a dead letter. And it wouldn't be many years after Mason died that it was finally declared to be just that. But our governing document was the United States Constitution, not the Northwest Ordinance. Mason perhaps was led too much by public opinion in the state of Michigan, but he knew his people, and his people wanted that state of theirs, their new state, to be developed as quickly as possible. And so Mason went along. He warned them on a couple of occasions, let's not do this too fast. But they didn't listen, and Mason went along. And as I mentioned, he was not a gifted person when it came to money management or coping with the financiers of the East. This was not his strong suit. But they authorized him to do it, and being a good soldier, he did it the best he could for Michigan. He was also conflicted in that, as a Virginian, he would have been very strongly attached to the ideals of Thomas Jefferson. But growing up as he did, when he did, and knowing who he did, and receiving his appointment from President Jackson, he was very much a Jacksonian. Man of the people, opening up of the West to the United States. So he was, in that sense, very beholden to the man who actually fired him. That being said, I think Mason stands today as his own man. And with the exception of Lewis Cass, our foremost statesman in the front rank of Michigan's men and women in public life, Stevens T. Mason. And I urge you, if you ever have the occasion to be in downtown Detroit, to visit Mr. Mason's gravesite. It's on Griswold, just a few blocks up from the river. I think the nearest point of reference, the Penobscot building, perhaps. Yeah. And pay your respects to the governor. He's got a nice statue there, and his gravesite is there. And we'll see how long he stays buried next time. But if it's fairly soon, I suppose I have another book out than having to do with the governor. Yes?
Do you think it's possible that Cass might have recommended him to President or Jackson for the governor?
You want to repeat the question since she's not at the mic?
Would you go to, I'll repeat the question. Was it possible that Governor Cass recommended Mason to President Jackson as governor? It's possible, I suppose. I have not come across that. I'm sure that Jackson listened to Cass because he was the wise head of the territory. And I'm sure in appointing Mr. Mason's secretary that he did it with Cass's approval. Cass had a very close relationship with Mason. And it was during the Toledo War, too, that Cass, at some risk to himself, twice warned Mason to cool his jets on this Toledo dispute, or President Jackson was going to fire him. Twice. And in fact, that's what happened. Mason chose to ignore Cass, chose to tell President Jackson that I'm in this for Michigan's good, and that was the result, being fired. Yes?
Can you elaborate on the move to Lansing, the details about that?
The move to Lansing of the state capital. Lansing was very much a compromise choice because they wanted the capital to be in more or less in the geographic center of this new state. That was not Detroit. It was not Ann Arbor, it was not Marshall, it wasn't Jackson. So Lansing Township, I don't think the place had even been platted then yet, was chosen as the site of the new capital. This would have been around, help me somebody, 1850 or so, somewhere around then. And eventually the building itself was built in Lansing, but very much a compromise choice by the legislature.
Building just east of Angel Hall named Mason. I assume it's named after him.
I should have mentioned that.
It was torn down in 1951 and
The original
rebuilt.
building isn't there anymore, but there's still a plaque on Mason Hall at the University of Michigan acknowledging Governor Mason's role as the father of the University of Michigan. The original building is long since gone. I should have mentioned that when I was talking about his role in building the University of Michigan. Mason Hall. And Mason, Michigan, and Mason County, and a couple of schools in the Detroit area named after Governor Mason as well. So he's left his mark. He's still with us. Yep, question.
My question follows up on the former Catholicopistimiad, and that is, what effects did Mason have in bringing the university to Ann Arbor, given that the 40 acres was already donated?
I don't know that Mason had that much to do with relocating the university to Ann Arbor. I think it was a choice made by people in the know at that time, the legislature, the regents of the University of Michigan, or that unpronounceable name that was attached to it at that time. But I don't think Mason had that much to do with the choice of Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor, at that time, the city fathers had made a generous grant of land to entice the university to the city, and that's what won them over. Yep.
I taught for many years at a school called Stevens T. Mason, and I knew he had been a governor, so I thank you for filling in all the other information. The other schools in the district were named after different figures in history, but not the ones that we always hear about. So the other two middle schools were John D. Pierce and Isaac E. Crary. Can you tell me anything about either of those people?
Pierce?
Yeah.
John Pierce was the governor's choice as Michigan's first superintendent of public instruction. This was written into Michigan's first constitution. It had never been done before in American history. But this is how Mason felt about free public education and how we need to safeguard educating our young people. John Pierce was an excellent mind, and Mason recognized this, and John Pierce was his first choice as superintendent of public instruction. Mr. Crary served in Congress as one of Michigan's first congresspersons, and again, a very close friend of Governor Mason, Isaac Crary. Yep.
Partial answer to Don about the University of Michigan. I'm a 50-year resident of Dexter, and there was always the rumor that there was a decision, because John Allen and Samuel Dexter were close friends, actually owned a newspaper together, that there was a opportunity for Dexter to be the spot for the University of Michigan. I think some of its residents think we actually won by having it in Ann Arbor, but that's another whole point. And then also the rumor that the first football game that was ever played by the University of Michigan was played in the field in front of Gordon Hall. Do you have any information on either one of those?
I had certainly heard the rumor, the first one that you mentioned. As for football, I have no idea about that rumor, or if there's any truth to it at all. It would be interesting, wouldn't it, if Governor Mason could come back today and what he would think about the University of Michigan football stadium and that tremendous crowd of people engaging in something, what did they call football when it first started out? Agitating a bag of wind. Isn't that when Penn first played Harvard, or one of those early games? But if he could come back today, I think he would be very pleased in his state university being recognized as the great university that it is. Yep, question.
Thank you. Two questions. One, I was born in Mason, Michigan, so I have a little affection for the boy governor.
Yes.
But two questions. The first one, were his public views on slavery the same as his private view? And the second question, what role, if any, did he play in having this first state prison in Jackson?
I'm not sure about the answer to the second. The first, though, is that his private views on slavery was that he abhorred it. From a moral standpoint, he absolutely abhorred it, and he said so. As for his public views, Mason was just enough of a states' rights person that he was very much a man of his times, and that he was willing to let the states decide this issue for themselves. This is 1835 now. He believed, as I believe Mr. Lincoln believed, that over time and with education, this peculiar institution would wither away. And that's what I believe that Mason felt as far as slavery. Now, he helped to put into the state constitution a provision forbidding slavery. Again, this was our constitution, that first one, 1835, was way ahead of its time. First superintendent of public instruction, forbidding slavery. But this was Mason's progressive liberal views that helped to write that constitution, even though he wasn't an actual delegate. His presence was very strongly felt. Yeah, question.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I was a little late coming from Lansing myself. I had the opportunity, actually the honor to speak Governor Mason's last funeral, which hopefully we won't have another one, or I'll live long enough to see the next one. But I'm intrigued by him from that experience. I also made arrangements that he be laid out at the Capitol the last time that he was disinterred. But the question
Yeah.
I'd have is, as a historian, if you kind of struck me when you're talking about being by his casket, and I have to think of all the things you're going through as his biographer. If you had Stephen T. Mason in this room right now, and we gave you the mic to ask him a question, what would you ask him?
If Governor Mason were in this room today, I would ask him about President Jackson. I would ask him what he was thinking when this whole dispute with Ohio was going on over Toledo. I would ask him his views on education, what went into the education article of that first Constitution. And then, just man to man, I would just like to sit down with him and talk about 1830 and 1835. What were conditions like in Detroit? What was Detroit like? What were fashions like? What were people saying to each other? What kind of gossip did you pick up about yourself as the boy governor that you could share with us? Oh, I could spend. If Governor Mason had the patience, I could spend probably a couple of days talking with him. But you know, I would take him for a tour of Ann Arbor. And I would take him to Detroit and see what this great city had become. Absolutely.
I don't know about the first football field. The first baseball field was roughly where the quadrangle is now. My question is this. The Toledo War, Toledo Strip, has quite an aura about it. But wasn't a similar issue raised on the southwestern boundary as well, with Indiana and access to Lake Michigan?
There was an issue, but not much of one, because when Indiana became a state in 1816, Indiana moved its border 10 miles north. Michigan did not object at that time. Territorial Governor Cass was off somewhere else, probably negotiating an Indian treaty or exploring, which is what he liked to do, so that nothing was said by Michigan to this land grab, as it could be called, by Indiana. So that a couple of years later, when Illinois became a state, they moved their boundary 50 miles north of what was accepted as the boundary line. And they didn't say anything then either. So Ohio had a point when they said, well, look, Michigan, you didn't object when Indiana and Illinois moved their boundaries. What right do you have to object to us when we adjusted our Constitution to include the Port of Toledo? Again, Mason was probably in the wrong, and he should have known better, basing his claim on the Northwest Ordinance. But that was the accepted Michigan boundary in those days. And he was prepared to go to war over it, and the result was the Toledo War. Yep. Question?
Yes, I was curious what you meant by part of the $5 million showing up later.
Of that $5 million, I think, as I recall, something like $40,000 came up missing from that trunk. And it later showed up at a post office, later being about 3 or 4 weeks. But by that time, the news had gotten out that the money had lined Mason's pocket and that he was getting rich off the state. Just completely untrue. But it didn't make any difference because Mason was attacked and vilified on all sides. He was accused of debauchery. And yet there has not been one hint of scandal that was ever attached to Stephen T. Mason's name. It didn't matter because the damage had been done, and he tried his best to regain his reputation, but without success. So that I'm thinking if he had ever mounted a comeback and returned to Michigan, perhaps based on the popularity that he still had as Michigan's boy governor, he may have succeeded. Because at that time, politics as we know it today was being born in the form of ideological positions being taken and the marketing of candidates. Madison Avenue wasn't around then yet, but candidates were being marketed. Think Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. Think log cabins and persons being associated with symbols that you could elect a person by. Harrison was the first one to benefit from that. And it all went, as we know it, the way it is today. Marketing, your availability as a candidate to speak in sound bites, etc. Yeah, question?
Was Mason involved at all in negotiations with Native Americans in the UP as far as rights to the resources?
No, Mason was not involved with that. All of the Indian treaties, pretty much all of them, had been negotiated by Lewis Cass in the days before Mason became governor. The Indians signed away, considerable chunks of land. And there again, one is wise to go behind what Territorial Governor Cass would say about the Indians and what he actually wrote about the Indians. And it's not always a pretty picture. And the treatment of the Indians at this time was not a very pretty picture either. And in his behalf, Cass negotiated terms for the Indians that were, in his day, considered liberal for the Indians. In our perspective, no, not so much. But no, Mason had no real hand in the negotiation of Indian treaties. Yep. Any other questions?
Can I just quickly ask, going back to what became of the Sioux Locks? I mean, I know when were they?
Yeah.
When were they started?
Mason died in 1843. The appropriation for the Sioux Locks, with federal help, came through about 1855, I'm thinking, so that the locks were started to be built by that time. Mason didn't live to see it, of course, but they contributed, the locks did, to Michigan becoming a mighty manufacturing and industrial state in the rest of that century of which Mason lived. And as you know, the locks continue today to be not only a source of great tourism for Michigan, but a source of economic strength. But again, we have Mason to thank for that. Yeah, question?
What happened with his wife and family?
Oh, what happened to his wife and family? I mentioned that his oldest son died very shortly after he died. His wife, there isn't much known. She did remarry a fellow by the name of McVickers, but even in the letters that she was writing to her parents, describing McVickers, she would still refer to her darling Mason, or Tom as he was called, her darling Stevens. And so we know from those letters at the Burton Historical Collection in Detroit, we know from those letters that she was in love with him yet years after he died and when she was going to remarry. So those are very tender. And to actually hold these letters in your hand and to read them, you just get a real sense of the poignancy, the pathos of losing a young man so young, so full of potential. That's why I say the story it's a tragic story with a mostly happy ending. I'm thinking of, well, what could have been? Dead at 31, what could have been? He could have gone on to greatness. He could have gone on to become somebody important on the national scene. We'll never know. But at least his wife remarried, and then nothing more is known of her from the record. That's it.
Last question, sir?
Yep.
I have an interesting vignette. I grew up on the Grand River. Of course, the Gerald Ford Museum is on the Grand River. I grew up pretty close there. Grand Haven, you'll know the town.
Of course.
And in school there, in the year 51, Gerald R. Ford came and spoke to our little fifth grade class, right in the classroom there. And I didn't know, I was looking at the future president.
None of us knew it at the time, and when I parked my bicycle outside of his mobile unit, of course, I had no idea. But Gerald Ford just had those, he had those traits. Anybody who's ever known Gerald Ford knows that he had those traits of honesty and integrity and openness and love of country and civic duty and public service, all these things. I'm in complete admiration of Gerald R. Ford, and that's why speaking here tonight is very special to me. And for that, Elaine, I thank you very much, and I thank you for your very kind attention.